Starting this video off strong with some pretty hefty disclaimers. Disclaimer number one is that I'm actually dog sitting right now, so we have more ambient dog noises in the background. But thankfully it's my video editor's dog, so I get to put that responsibility on editing out all the dog noises on them. So thank you, ampersand waves, everybody pray for waves. Disclaimer number two is that I know some of you want me to be facing the camera while I'm talking to you guys about lore, and I want to say shout out and thank you to my patrons who have allowed me to be able to invest in this channel, and I'm actually going to be using my next round of Patreon money to be able to afford a teleprompter and a new camera. So thank you so much. You guys make this channel better all the time, and I want to also give a huge shout out to my Twitch subscribers and my YouTube members. Thank you so much for allowing me to be able to do this for you guys. It is such a privilege, and I'm really excited to continue making more videos. Disclaimer number three is that my community and I can't seem to come to a consensus on how to pronounce this region. Some of us have been calling it Rauh, some of us have been calling it Rauh, and some of us have been calling it Rauh. I'm going to be calling it Rauh for simplicity's sake, but also because I really like Egyptian mythology, and I'm just putting my foot down about it. But I'm going to be talking about the ancient ruins of Rauh today, so let's go. Let's start. We're going to be talking about the ancient ruins of Rauh today, which is my favorite region in the game, but it is also one of the most complex as it seems to be changed by a lot of different factions in the game. For example, some of the cultural information has been scraped away by the scholars of antiquity from Bellurath, set ablaze by Mesmer's forces, or influenced by the manifestation of Scarlet Rot. Bellurath also built new structures on top of these ruins with the addition of the Church of the Bud and the viewing platform that overlooks the Divine Tower. We can tell that these buildings weren't here originally because of the masonry and the roofing. They're not made out of the same black stone that the ruins of Rauh are made out of. These ruins have been through a lot, and it required a lot of effort to tease everything apart. So let's get started with what we know from the base game, and then how each culture has then been impacted by Rauh in the present. And then we'll talk about maybe some cut content and some other stuff too. So yeah, let's get started. In the base game, the Rauh ruins sprawl across the entire map and are known as the Blackstone Ruins. The giant golem enemies are described to have weapons made of black stone and are from this society. And sure enough, we can find one last stone golem stationed on the Rauh plateau. The Rauh ruins are also linked to large structures like the Fire Giant's Forge, and in addition to this, the Fire Giant's Forge has shared assets with the Divine Towers, which I broke down in a previous video that I'll link in the description down below. The Talisman of all Crucibles states that this growth grew on giants, so while our tiny kings, the Divine Bird Warriors, populated these ruins, there's a lot of evidence that giants also lived among the ruins of Rauh, along with the dead bodies in Caelid, the mountaintops, and in the specimen storehouse. It appears that gigantism was a little bit more common and widespread than it currently is. I want to make a point to say too that Tony Pepperoni in my community pointed out during one of our Lore Theory Thursdays that the dragons that live on the mountaintops of the giants were actually originally forced off of the mountaintops by the giants. So the dragons were not included in the Club of Rauh, the ancient Club of Rauh. There are also the Harpy enemies that are found around these ruins, and they sing a song in Latin about the fall of the previous era, loosely affiliating them with the ancient ruins of Rauh, but we don't hear much about them in the DLC, so I'm not putting too much stock in that, but I'm just kind of keeping it in mind that it seems that there was a bunch of different types of humanoids and creatures that existed in this previous era in tandem with each other. So now that we have a vague idea of what the past may have looked like, let's look at a present civilization that is currently investigating these ruins. I want to start with the civilization most inspired by them, Bellurath. Bellurath has a lot of Roman inspiration, specifically the era of Rome that took over Celtic land in 51 BC and then established Roman Egypt in 30 BC. This takes place before the Christianization of Rome in 300 AD, as I feel that Marika and Leyendell represent that transition, but I've talked about that in other videos, so I'm not going to touch that here. This would explain why we see Egyptian artifacts scattered around Bellurath and why the Hornsent NPCs have Irish accents.
Oh, such a joy to smell the scent again.
It's why the Wickermen are present, despite Bellurath's architecture being Roman. The Hornsent NPCs also use a weapon called the Falx, which is used by the Dacians, the Thracians, is it Thracian? Thracians, and the Scythians, which the Scythians also inspired the Celts down to their metalworking. As far as allegories go, we can understand that Bellurath absorbed and conquered many cultures like Rome did during this period, thanks to the Inquisitors. And so it stands to reason that Rauh has been absorbed by Bellurath in a similar fashion. However, the writers make sure to establish that the Hornsent seem to have ancestors from Rauh in the Divine Bird Warriors, stating that the Divine Bird Warriors were the very first horned warriors that we now see protecting the Tower of Bellurath. While their migration down to the Bellurath region is unclear, NPCs like Divine Bird Warrior Ornis seem to have fallen off of the foundation of Rauh to an already established temple quarter, where he then lived the rest of his life as a guardian deity. This obviously influenced the Hornsent warriors, as their warrior armor and weapons take inspiration from these bird warriors. At some point in history, the scholars of antiquity from Bellurath began to study and emulate Rauh's spiritual practices. They worshipped divine beasts in the same way, by hunting them down and gaining their power. The Crucible Vortex, or Spira, becomes important to the Inquisitors, and they even praise the Crucible for giving them their horns. The scholars document a practice Rauh engaged in which allowed them to contain spiritual energy in small stone sculptures called the Rauh Burrows. Subsequently, Bellurath's knowledge was stolen by Messmer's forces, and at this point you can probably see why I was stressing about this video, as the transition of knowledge between all of these different groups make it super difficult to parse, and I am so sorry for my editor. While Messmer's original aim was to annihilate all aspects of Hornsent culture, Fire Knights Salza and Heald urged that the Hornsent specimens and Hornsent cultural knowledge be preserved in the specimen storehouse. Despite Queen Marika and Messmer's desire to have the Hornsent eradicated, Queen Marika benefited from the preservation of this knowledge, as we see stone tablets and birch scrolls in Queen Marika's bedchambers. I'll speculate what she may have been researching in another video, but Miquella was also fascinated by this knowledge. One of these birch scrolls that illustrates Radahn's vow, the secret rite, can be found in the storehouse and given to Freya even though she can't fucking read it.
Will I ever make sense of this jumble?
It was used by Miquella to attach Radahn's soul to Mohg's remains. That Lord must usher in God's return, and that the God will attach himself or herself to their chosen Lord. Choosing Radahn thematically ties in with Radahn being a lion-themed golden warrior whose soul is inhabiting a horned figure, similar to the horned warriors, and also echoing the divine beasts. I want to say that Godfrey and Siraj also vaguely emulate this, but I can do a whole video on them alone at another time. But now that we see how they've impacted other groups, let's take a look into why this region seems to be so important. The Crucible. Geographically, there is something very unique about Rauh. While there are special horned enemies across the Shadowlands, killing the animals that are native to this particular section of ruins in Rauh gives you access to a special crafting item known as the Spirit Calculus, which says an exceedingly rare to find calculus, suffused with spirituality and found by hunting horned beasts in the ancient ruins of Rauh. It has a distinctive acrid odor, which some claim to be a sign of a particular spiritual potency. A calculus, also known as a calculus stone, is a type of solid material that forms in the kidneys, and I feel that this item is referencing a couple of things. First, the obvious one, kidney stones. In some old medical beliefs in parts of Asia, the kidneys were thought to store, make, transform, and distribute spiritual essence. In the English language, they're also known as calculus stones in medical science, but aesthetically, the item itself resembles a teratoma, which is a type of growth that can be filled with hair, teeth, and keratin because of stem cells. This item can also be used to make a sprite stone, and then detonated using a bond stone, which kind of resembles sperm. So for those of you out there who thought that the divine spirals resembled DNA, I don't think that you're that far off. This torrent of spiritual energy being associated with stem cells and reproductive cells is pretty on the nose. There's some fantastical medical science embedded in the world building, and not to get too out there, but DNA strands, flower petals, tree branches, horns, and spirals are all manifestations of the Fibonacci sequence in nature. In the 1500s, the golden ratio was seen as divine, simplistic, and orderly, and it's one of the most efficient patterns in nature. So it's really cool to see it being used in a fictional setting to world build. I think it's a really cool creative decision on the artists and the writers' part. Anyway, back to lore stuff and away from art design. The people of Rauh made stone burrows that acted as containers for spiritual essence that's present within the calculus stone. To craft this item, you need a stone burrow, a beast horn, and a spirit calculus. Beast's horn states that they're suffused with spirituality and that the Crucible has a particularly strong influence on the beasts in the realm of shadow. This further connects Rauh to a powerful concept known as the Crucible, and may be why the Hornsent develop horns in the first place. The Hornsent view the Crucible as sacred for the refinement wrought through its evolutionary gifts, most prominently their tangled horns. This ties in with Marika wanting to seal away this particular region, and also ties into the punishment of the Misbegotten. The Misbegotten are held to be punishment for making contact with the Crucible, and from birth, they're treated as slaves, or worse. Any infant born with horns is also labeled a foul omen and thrown into the sewers, which it seems that she was trying to suppress these aspects of the Crucible, but I'm going to get back on topic. There are other things that link the Crucible to the Rauh ruins. Devonia, who's the first of the Crucible Knights, set out on a journey to discover the origin of the Crucible, which seems to exist in or around Rauh. An aspect of the Crucible is a flower, and the Church of the Bud existed here, worshipping flowers that used to be unaffiliated with the Scarlet Rot. We find that the aspect of the Crucible, Bloom, is located here, as well as the talisman of all Crucibles, which includes horns, feathers, flowers, thorns, breath, and wings. Given the usage of the incantation Spira on the Divine Tower and its proximity to Rauh, the Crucible Vortex, and the Spirit Calculus farming location, I feel that from the Divine Tower up to the ruins of Rauh is the whole Crucible. Some members of my community speculate that this could have been where the Elden stars originally fell, but it's unclear. In fact, I can confidently say that I don't have an actual answer as to what the Crucible truly is, outside of some vague inferences from the item descriptions here. The Crucible armor states that it holds the power of the Crucible life, the primordial form of the Erdtree. It strengthens aspects of Crucible incantations. And then the Gilded Great Shield says, a red tinge on gold coat mirrors the primordial matter that became the Erdtree, a color of homeward yearning. Devonia's hammer reads, a weapon forged of primordial gold, marked by its reddish hue and inhabited by ancient holiness. A torrent of life is engraved upon the striking face. And then the aspect of the Crucible Horns incantation says that this is a manifestation of the Erdtree's primal vital energies, an aspect of the primordial Crucible, where all life was once blended together. So it could be that the Crucible is just a region, or it could be that the Crucible is that divine light that's in the spirit calculus that causes a lot of the excessive horn growth on a lot of these different entities. Whatever this spiritual light or the spiritual essence is, wherever that came from could be the Crucible. Or I think that another thing that me and my community have been speculating on is that the region that the Divine Tower was built on top of, because the Divine Tower is that big spiral tower, that may be where the Crucible actually is, and that Rauh was just in proximity of it. So maybe there's just like I almost feel like it's the whole western side of the map that could be the Crucible, because I feel like there's a lot of this really interesting vortex energy and primordial matter and a lot of this really cool stem cell stuff that's happening in these locations. I want to get into some cut content speculation now, and feel free to disregard this section of the video if you don't like cut content. I'm going to put a disclaimer alert. It's cut content, babes. It's not that serious. So, Rauh is a Bronze Age civilization. We get the verdigris talisman that we find from Moore at the base of the female statue. It's an oxidized bronze or a copper, and Moore's equipment also ties into this. Moore's shield has this unique ability where it can create a teal bulwark that protects the user even after death. While I say that the Fell God is tied to the Bronze Age civilizations and the Fire Giants, I feel like this outer god of verdigris has some different abilities that seem less destructive and more protective, but I'm still uncertain. A neat little fun fact, though, is that the Miranda idol, is that what it's called? The little Miranda flower idol, appears like it could have been verdigris underneath the scarlet rot that's on top of it, and the art resembles that of Moore's set, which is tied to Rauh, given that we find the verdigris talisman here. I would have loved to learn more about the Miranda flowers and the flower crucible, as we know that they can use pillars of light, and I feel like that light theme ties in with the fact that the zone as a whole is associated with light, whereas the abyssal forest and like the eastern side of the map is associated with darkness. We can find an ancient ruin here that allows us to complete the Sword of Light quest, and the Church of the Bud, since buds were being worshipped and were unafflicted with scarlet rot previously to Romina, it seems like maybe there was this flower of light that used to bud here. Rauh seems to be teeming with this influential divine spiritual energy that is depicted in the spirit calculus as a white light, and the ruins of Unte, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, can become the ruins of darkness, which makes sense as they're in proximity of the abyssal forest, like I said before. So there seems to be a lot of motifs of light and darkness in the DLCs specifically, and I do feel like this may tie into Meteor and the cosmic story of the DLC and light traveling and life and death and the creation of the universe. I think it's like Miyazaki's creation myth is tied to this region of Rauh. To kind of give like a whole synopsis on how I feel like the history played out, I feel that Fair Missoula, Jagged Peak, and the Finger Ruins would be referencing a lot of the Neolithic eras of history, as a lot of the different artifacts that we find in the game are Neolithic pieces of art that we can find in real life. And I want to credit Tarnished Archaeologists for pointing out that Fair Missoula is based off of the necropolis of Varna, and I want to give a credit to KYUKE for talking to me about the Tower of Silence, which has also influenced Fair Missoula, and also Emily Mitchell, who showed me this really cool Neolithic flute that looks a lot like the Finger Ruins flute. And I believe it was also Tarnished Archaeologists that brought up there is a like French tomb that also mirrors the fingerprint shield and some of the fingerprint art that's happening. So there's this whole era of Stone Age art and like Neolithic art that mirrors this era of beasts in Elden Ring. I would say this is like the era before written language. It's before a lot of like blacksmithing stuff. And then the era of dragons gets displaced from the mountaintops by the fire giants during the Bronze Age. Rauh and the fire giants would be another reference to that Bronze Age society. I think that the Master of Beasts artistic motif from the Indus Valley and from other parts of like India, Asia, like really ancient Pakistan, and like ancient Egypt, I'll put some pictures. The Master of Beasts motif definitely echoes in a lot of Rauh's spiritual practices, so I think that's super cool. And then I feel that the Ul Palace ruins would have been active during this period too, given a lot of the Mesopotamian references that are happening. But yeah, there's a lot of really cool historical references that give us like a vague idea of what time period each event in the game happens. It can kind of like help us figure out like, okay, so this is the area before the Christianization of Rome, so this must have happened before. And sure enough, in the in-game lore, it happens before. So we're able to kind of make sense of what's happening because so much of the in-game lore is left out. And I think that Miyazaki and the art team are using a lot of art history and art to communicate their story. So it's a whole fucking lot, and I'm doing my best out here. So thank you so much for watching this video. I want to also make a little point to talk about some really random notes at the end of this video. For some reason, Mesmer's flame leaves behind small embers that also act as sprites and can be housed in Rauh burrows, similarly to the spirit calculus. And I think this may be the Abyss companion because Mesmer's associated with the Abyssal Serpent and his fire has this abyssal nature to it. I think that this may be the darkness or the abyssal companion to the light version of the sprites, if that makes sense. So there's like how there's a sword of darkness and a sword of light. I think that there is a sprite burrow of darkness and a sprite burrow of light. So it's pretty interesting to see that it has a companion. And then also when I was discussing the Christianization of Rome, I bring up Irish accents. Obviously, I don't know what ancient Celtic accents look like, and I don't know if FromSoft had access to that, but I think it's really cool that we see this persistence of Irish accents throughout Bellurath and like throughout a lot of these ancient Celtic societies, and then we see it again when Landell Capital gets established with the Finger Maidens who have Irish accents, and they also vaguely resemble the Grandams aesthetically, so it kind of further shows this trickle down of culture from Rauh, Bellurath, and then into Marika's age. So you love to see these like cycles of beliefs and practices, even though Marika is trying to distance herself from the past in a lot of ways. Another really cool little fun fact that somebody pointed out is that Godfrey and Godric have Cornish accents, and all of the Liurnians have Welsh accents, which gives us further regional lore to understand what period of history certain things are. But yeah, that's it. That's all. This video was a fucking nightmare. Sorry that it's really long. Okay, bye! I totally forgot to film the conclusion of my video, so here we go. Rome conquered the Celts, and they conquered an area called Gaul, and the people in that area worshipped a god called Belenus, who is the Celtic sun god of fire, and he's like a cleansing fire. He's like a healing, cleansing fire. So there's this association, sorry, I'm like shaking my whole setup. There's this association with Bellurath looking like Rome, conquering people who have Irish accents, and then also the fell god that is like in their sagas being a sun god, or like his imagery resembling a sun. And then also we have like the Dung Eater, who has the mending rune of the fell curse, which looks like there's little tiny suns in addition to horns in it, and it kind of looks like a cell, if a sun were like a cell being split. There's a lot of like really cool, like I said, medical mutations regarding divine light, and I think that Belenus is being referenced in the story, both with like all of the references to Julius Caesar and the Celtic people, but then also with the Wicker Man, and also with the Fell God, and blah, 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 blah. I think that the fact that the fire giants are associated with the ruins of Rauh also play into this as well, and George R.R. Martin is no stranger to using real-world history as a means to inform the lore or the world building of his stories. I've mentioned this before, but Game of Thrones is based off of the War of the Roses, so it is really cool to see that there's like another historical thing that's happening here. So yeah. Okay, I think that's it. I think that might be it. Oh, also, another cool historical thing, because we were talking about Egypt before, and there's definitely some like Egypt stuff that's happening in Bellurath. There is the god of sun who fights a serpent, and I think that one half of the map, which is associated with like Rauh and Bellurath being associated with like the sun god and this divine light and the sword of light, versus the right half of the map, the eastern half of the map, being associated with the abyss and the sword of darkness, and also the abyssal serpent, I think plays into the myth of sorry, I'm like trying to remember all these names, plays into the myth of Apep and Rauh, which I'll send a picture to my video editor. But yeah, the Guardian Watchdog also kind of resembles this little reference. So we have a war happening between the sun and the abyss. Cool. Okay, bye.